Great.
Super. Well, we'll let everybody get settled in. Please do let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. We'd love to know, and just get yourselves ready for what we know is going to be a very informative and empowering evening for us to demystify a topic that we know is potentially very complex, and we're lucky to have someone with us that can help us just break that down and understand that better as well. So like Ebony said, let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. We've got quite a few more people still joining, so we'll give you all a chance just to settle in.
So Katie, where are you?
I'm just outside Manchester, although it feels like we're in some sort of tropical monsoon at the moment. It's quite something here.
And Matt is back from sunny Ibiza, now in sunny Sussex. And Rhys, where are you dialing in from?
I'm in central London, which is very drab at the moment, especially at 7:30 when everyone's gone home. It's very quiet, very wet, and not the nicest place to be, for sure.
Well, we appreciate your dedication for being here for us, Rhys. Thank you. We're all very grateful.
Very excited to meet everyone.
Super. So we'll just give everyone another 30 seconds to join in. I can see we've got a couple of people replying in the chat, letting us know where you're dialing in from, but we'd love to know where everyone else is from as well. Please do use the chat box. It's going to be of your benefit soon. Later on, Ebony will reveal all, but we've got a really cool opportunity for any of you that are live here to win a really awesome prize. So if any of you saw a little hint of what that might be, it's to do with a certain large conference that's taking place next week. If that is something that might tickle your fancy, then stay tuned in, because some good opportunities are coming up for that later on the call.
Oh, we've got Cornwall, we've got Dorset, we've got Norfolk. Love this.
Oh,
we've got your fan club, Rhys, as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
So
there's some familiar names on the list.
Oh, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I think we can probably have a little look at getting started. So we wanted to start off with telling you a little bit about us as VetYou before we get started and hand over to our fantastic speaker this evening. So I'm going to start off with handing to Matt Dobbs, who is one of the co-founders of VetYou, alongside myself, Ebony, and Paul Horwood. And Matt's going to tell you a little bit more about who VetYou are, what we're about, and why we're here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Katie. Well, just a couple of words from me to say VetYou does exactly what it says on the tin. It's all about you. So it's the one time you can be self-indulgent and completely selfish. Selfless doesn't necessarily come into it. And what I mean is this is all about looking after you and your finances. All of the VetYou team have had very varied and different careers in veterinary medicine. But one thing that we've all done is try to look after our own personal finances. So whether you currently work as an independent vet, whether you're locuming, or whether you work for a corporate group or an independent practice, your independent financial status is really what's going to set you apart and make you a success in whichever direction you choose your veterinary career to go. Because once you can get in control of your personal finances, then you'll really find that your career can blossom because you'll have so many more choices in life. So VetYou is simply about making sure that you make the right personal finance decisions. And if you remember nothing else tonight, which I'm sure you will, because we've got a wonderful speaker in a minute, just think about three things. One, make sure that you look after your health and how can you secure that for the future. Two, look after your income and how can you make sure that you're always protected and have an income. And finally, look after your future. Have a think about what measures you can take now to secure your independent financial future. Anyway, that's enough from me, and back over to you, Katie.
Thank you so much for the fantastic intro to us, Matt. And if that is of interest to any of you, we've recently had an event on pensions, an accountancy event. We've got some more events coming up as well, which we'll give you more details on shortly. But seeing as we're talking about you, we thought now would be the opportune moment for us to run a really quick poll and just find out who we've got in the audience, because this is going to help Rhys as well to understand who he's speaking to this evening. And we'd love just to know who he is here. So who is full-time employed, who's a locum or a freelancer? Do we have employers? Do we have recruiters? Do we have anyone that falls under the category of other? If that is you, please do drop it in the chat as well and see who we've potentially missed off the list inadvertently. So please do drop that in there. I can see we've got 64% of you are answered this. We've currently got around 65% of you are locums and freelancers. 5% employers, about a quarter full-time employed, and 14% other. So those of you that are voting other, please let us know in the chat box so we've got an idea of who's here, because that is going to help us all moving forward. So okay, we've got part-time employed, part-time locum, super, that explains it. Thank you so much for that. So I think we can probably end that poll there. We've got nearly 90% of you, so that ends up with 60% of you are locums and freelancers, about 4% employers, 20% full-time employed staff. So thank you so much for that, Ebony. That's brilliant. So that takes us on to being so pleased to introduce our fantastic speaker for this evening. We're really pleased to be joined by Rhys Thomas from WTT Consulting. WTT brings together experienced tax, legal and financial professionals working together to develop robust defences to ongoing tax matters. Now, we know that specifically they deal with IR35 a lot, but the really interesting thing to us and why we're so particularly grateful to Rhys for giving up his time this evening as well is that he has personal experience of this in the veterinary profession. His sister is a vet and he's helped her to navigate this, so he understands a lot of the nuances and the ins and outs of how we're experiencing this in the vet profession at the moment as well. So without further ado, thank you so much, Rhys, for joining us this evening, and I'll hand over to you to explain a little bit more about myth-busting IR35 before we hand to Q&A at the end as well. So thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. As a short introduction there, my name is Rhys Thomas. I'm the Managing Director of WTT, and we are tax and legal advisors for the locum and freelancing industry. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully, it should all work nice and easily.
Just while Rhys is doing that, just remember there's no such thing as a stupid question today. If you're thinking it, I guarantee someone else on this call is thinking it too. So do get it into the chat. We're also aware that sometimes people don't want to ask it openly. You can direct message Rhys, Katie, myself, or Matt, and we can ask on your behalf as well. And if you hear jargon, if you hear acronyms you don't understand or jargon, you call it out in that chat box, and we will ensure that £5 goes to VetLife for every jargon call out that you do. So we tend to get between 1 or 2. So we tend to £5 per one. So we tend to give about 10 quid to VetLife per session.
Oh, blimey. You might be giving a bit more tonight. There's a lot of jargon in 35.
No
So you just have to
Rhys.
explain it well, Rhys. You just have to explain it well.
I'm not fancying my chances. Good. Okay. Well, as some of you have heard there, I do have a personal interest in the veterinary industry. I've seen how hard my sister has worked to get to where she's got to, and equally, therefore, I'm assuming the same is true for everyone on this call. You've all worked incredibly hard to reach the professional stages you have, and I'm therefore a firm believer that a piece of tax legislation shouldn't force you to lose your independence about deciding how you work. As Matt said there, independence and your own decision making is paramount to your own career and how you want to run it. So I'm a firm believer, and I'm hoping today this kind of myth busting, demystifying, however you want to call it, will allow people to take control of their careers for sure, but most importantly, not allow a seemingly complex piece of legislation affect that, which it is. I'm sure everyone
I think we might have just lost
who
Rhys.
kind of familiar with the problems it's been causing. So a history of IR35. We'll talk around the recent reforms, and that's the most important part, the off-payroll rules, as they're known as. We'll talk about who that applies to. We'll talk about important considerations and how you assess IR35, looking at what are commonly known as the 4 pillars of IR35, and an important piece of new legislation, the disagreement process. We'll then move on to alternative models. We'll look at some contractual clauses and indemnities to watch out for, and then over to you guys for any questions that you might have towards the end. So quite a bit to go through, so let's crack on. Firstly, a few quick myths I'd like to dispel. IR35 isn't anything new. It was introduced in 1999 in a paper written by HMRC, and it was then brought into legislation in the year 2000. It's been around for a long time. It's not anything new, it's just how things have changed through the reforms that is the new bit that we're going to go through today. There's an awful lot of contradiction, and I know this next statement might seem like a contradictory view to what is put out there a lot, but IR35 changes and what's happening there can be a massive commercial advantage for people that get it right, be those locums or practices who really understand and take the time to work through IR35 properly. You're going to be able to hire exceptional talent on an outside of 35 basis that the big practices are too risk adverse to take on. So you can bring in really, really good talent at potentially a better rate. At the same time, skilled locums are going to have greater flexibility that I mentioned, and perhaps more importantly, earning power. So there's massive opportunities with IR35 and massive incentive for everyone to get it right. So hopefully we can go through it today so that everyone is getting it right. The off-payroll reforms also don't apply to everyone. I think that's an important point. And again, we're going to go through a flow chart today as to who it applies to, how it applies, and try and make it super simple. I think most importantly, there is an awful lot of misinformation. As with anything, I'm pretty sure you all as vet professionals would say, don't Google something when your animal is poorly, bring them in to see a professional. That's the same is true here. Don't Google everything, just speak to people. We offer free consultations, we do events like this. There's a lot of information available for you to talk through with people who know what they're talking about. So try not to Google, try to understand it as best you can by speaking to people who know what's going on. 3 other quick myths. You are not alone, most importantly here. This is taken from a poll of our clients that we took. The questions were, do you think the practice you work for understands the IR35 reforms? 66% said no. Has your practice spoken to you about the reforms? 49% said no. But a big stat here, 94% of our respondents were concerned about the IR35 reforms. So you are not alone. This is an incredibly worrying situation, piece of legislation, reform. It doesn't need to be, but it is, and it's understandable why people are concerned about the reforms. So moving on, a short history of IR35, as I say, introduced in April 2000 after being announced in 1999 under Chapter 8 of ITEPA. And little known fact, so-called because the press release which announced it coming in was called Inland Revenue 35, hence the name IR35 always stuck. Basically, the purpose of IR35, or why it was created, was to clamp down on the increased use of one-man bands using personal service companies or little limited companies, where if you took a small salary and a dividend, you were paying a significantly lower tax rate than you were if you were employed. The purpose of IR35 remains the same today. It's to try and tax self-employed people who operate in the same way as an employee, the same rates as employees. That's all it's there to do. If you're on a desk with someone, you're in practice with someone and they are an employee and you are self-employed, and you are paying substantially less tax, but you're doing exactly the same thing as an employee, that is what IR35 seeks to counter. It seeks to tax people who do substantially the same work as an employee in the same way as an employee. The reforms we're going to talk about today were initially introduced for the public sector in 2017. We saw the NHS take on the brunt of that. We've seen the NHS have a few incorrect determinations assessed, which have subsequently resulted in some big liabilities. It was due to be rolled out in April 2020, but due to COVID, it was suspended until April 2021 in the private sector, and it has now been rolled out to the private sector too. So IR35 is here. It's not looking likely to go anywhere at the moment. You need to know these rules if you're working or hiring in the locum space. So what are the reforms known as the off-payroll rules? The purpose of the reforms, if there's one most easy way to put it, is that it changes the party responsible for making the status determination. It changes the party that decides whether IR35 applies. Now, that's an important point because traditionally, the locum has decided if IR35 applies or not. And at the same time, they take on the risk of getting that wrong. The changes now mean that the practice makes the determination. And if there's no one else in the supply chain, takes on the risk. Now that's important for a number of reasons, because HMRC will now, instead of having to go to 100 locums, make an assessment and then decide it, and chase 100 locums, we'll now just have to chase one practice to get to 100 locums. Similarly, the whole purpose again of IR35 is to try and streamline the tax system to say that self-employed people doing an employee's job should be taxed as employees. So the same rules apply there. If now the locums are making the determination, the practice is making the determination, not the locum, there's a much better opportunity that the tax system is streamlined because the practice makes the determinations and can deduct tax at source. So that's an important point, is that the real change has come about by the party being responsible now shifting up the supply chain away from the locum. That liable party is then liable for any lost tax, and that lost tax really comes from the difference in dividend rates and employment or income rates. The most important thing from today is that these changes require a joined up supply chain. There is a lot of thought in the supply chain at the moment that it's thus us and them. It's now, well, you're changing the way I work, or you're trying to affect how I work, or you're potentially bringing risk on the company. That's completely the wrong way to look at it. As I said before, it presents a huge commercial advantage for the supply chain to be talking to each other. So locums to be talking to their practices, to build really effective relationships, to understand how the contract is going to run, to understand all the parameters of how what everyone expects from the contract, and to deliver the contract. Presents a huge opportunity for everyone in the supply chain to talk to each other effectively. And there's good legislative reason to do that, because to not do that invites risk on everyone. So it really requires a joined up supply chain. It really requires everyone to be speaking to each other, and everyone to be checking contracts, and everyone to understand their role in the supply chain and how they help everyone else. Most importantly, though, there is also an increased requirement for due diligence, which we'll go through now. So who does the off-payroll rules apply to? The off-payroll rules apply to any locum providing services via a personal service company, so a small limited company, or a partnership. It doesn't apply to those working through umbrellas, and it doesn't apply to those working as sole traders. I will come on and talk about both sole traders and umbrellas later on in the presentation, but suffice it to say, the purpose of IR35 is to try and tax people who are employees on employment rates, income tax rates. Therefore, if you are working through an umbrella, you're already paying income tax. If you're working through sole trader, you're already paying income tax. So the IR35 rules don't apply to those situations. The off-payroll rules apply to only medium or large size practices or agencies that sit in between them. And that is, you've got to have two of these: an annual turnover of less than, to be a small company and therefore not subject to the off-payroll rules, you've got to have two of annual turnover of less than 10.2, balance sheet of no more than 5.1 million, and no more than 50 employees. Now, for a lot of practices in the UK, that will be the case. Where that is the case, and we'll go through the flowchart in a minute, the old rules apply. You have a small company's exemption and the old rules apply. So the locum or the PSC makes the determination. It's going to be an important point for lots of companies, though, that if you're looking near breaching those thresholds, you must keep all of that in mind, because the moment those thresholds are breached in your company accounts means you need to change your compliance processes. So let's just go now to the flowcharts, which are going to be handed out after the presentation. So you'll have all of these. This first one is for locums. Don't know if this is showing up yet. I hope it is. And it walks you through the decision-making process you need to take when you are identifying, firstly, whether or not IR35 applies, and then the steps you need to take. They're interactive, so they'll take you through each step. First question, are you operating as a PSC or partnership? So earlier I said, if you're not operating as a partnership, in a PSC or a partnership, IR35 doesn't apply to you. Therefore, your answer here is no, and it will take you to outcome one. Outcome one is off-payroll rules do not apply to you. Your liability is none. You'll be taxed elsewhere. So moving back through it, if the answer is yes, you move to the second question. Is the practice that you will be contracting with a small company or wholly overseas? In that instance, that small company exemption applies, where we discussed annual turnover of 10.2, balance sheet of no more than 5.1 million, and no more than 50 employees. Or is the practice entirely overseas, i.e. they don't have any practices in the UK, they've got no presence in the UK whatsoever. And there's a link here which details a little bit more about that as well. If the answer is yes there, you go to outcome two. Outcome two, if your practice is a small company or wholly overseas, the original rules apply, as we say. So therefore the locum or the PSC decides its own IR35 status, and any liabilities for unpaid taxes sit with the PSC.
Rhys, can I just jump in really quickly?
Of
We've had
course.
someone just call out some jargon in the chat and just asking you to confirm what a PSC is, just while we're just on this topic.
Okay.
I thought it would be a good thing to just jump in now.
Very good. Well, that's £5 at least. So personal service company is the limited company that self-employed people often work through. So they have a company, they set it up overnight called Rhys Thomas Limited or whatever. And that company then engages with the practice. So the engagement is between the vet practice and the limited company, rather than the vet practice and the individual. And if you're working through a personal service company, i.e. limited company, it allows you to plan your remuneration in a way which you take dividends instead of all income. That's what lots of people do. So where that's the case, then the dividend rates are substantially lower than the income tax rates. So people tend to plan their affairs when they're working as a self-employed person through a limited company, which means that their tax rates can be lower in most instances. So a personal service company is referred to here as a PSC, and well called out, justified call out on the jargon there, but that's typically, those are the entities that people operate through when they're self-employed. So moving on to the next stage, let's assume that the practice is a big operation and it's not a small company. Therefore, the practice in this instance must make the determination for IR35. They must use reasonable care, and we'll come on to talk about reasonable care in blanket determinations, which I know a lot of you have suffered from recently. And the outcome is that a status determination statement, or SDS, must be issued to you as a locum. Now, a status determination statement is basically a document which says, we have made this determination that you are either inside IR35, and therefore we'll be deducting tax on your behalf and paying that across to HMRC, or you are outside IR35, and therefore we will pay you the gross, and you can decide what you do with it and how you tax yourself. So that status determination is a really important document, which is the method of telling everyone in the supply chain where the liability is and what they need to do. So in that instance, let's say that the practice hasn't issued a status determination statement. In this instance, the locum doesn't need to do anything. The practice is liable for any unpaid taxes because they have not provided a valid status determination statement. This is why it's really important for any practice owners to be sure that if they don't fit within the small companies exemption, they are issuing a status determination statement. That is important. So here, the contractor or the locum doesn't need to do anything because a status determination statement hasn't been issued. So let's say the practice has done their job, they've issued the determination, and the determination is inside IR35. The question then comes down to, do you agree with it being inside or outside? And there's a disagreement process where you don't agree with that. We're going to come on to talk about the disagreement process in more detail, so I'll save that for now. But the status disagreement means I don't agree with what you're saying. There is then a process which we'll go over later that the practice needs to go through. But let's, for the sake of this, say, yep, I agree with the determination, it's inside IR35. You then question, is there an agency, i.e. a recruitment company in the middle there? And the answer is either yes or no. We'll come down to 5 and 6. If the outcome is 5, i.e. that there's an agency in there, or a recruitment company, the agency will make the deductions and pay you the net value. So if your day rate is £100 and the tax on that £100 is 20, the agency will deduct the 20, they'll pay that across to HMRC, and they'll pay you the 80. And that's how inside IR35 determinations work. If there is no agency in the chain, the practice does that job. The practice won't pay you the 100, the practice will pay you the 80, and they'll pay HMRC the 20 themselves. So moving back up here, the determination's been made and it's outside IR35. Again, do you agree with it? We'll come on to it. So let's assume yes. Again, is the PSE being supplied by an agency? So we're going down to 7 and 8 here. If outcome 7, your practice will pay, this is where there's no agency, your practice will pay the PSE without deductions. So in that instance, the 100, i.e. your day rate, is sent straight to you with no deduction at all. You are then duty bound to pay your own taxes, file your tax return, and conduct your affairs with HMRC directly. Similarly, if there's an agency in the chain, the practice will pay the agency the 100, the agency will pay you the 100, and then you will again do your tax. So the difference for locums here is if you're inside IR35, you're going to get paid a net amount of money that you then need to do no further deductions for tax on. That's your money to keep and do what you want with. If you're outside IR35, you're going to get a gross payment. So that 100, and then you need to do the taxes and you need to deduct. So that's the flowchart for locums. And again, it's fairly straightforward. It's all interactive, so you don't need to scroll and everything. But moving on for the same for the practices, largely the same rules apply. You got to follow your chart. Is the role for the locum, i.e., is the role you are putting out there for someone operating through a PSC, personal service company, small limited company, or a partnership? Again, if it's a no, the IR35 rules won't apply. If it's a yes, it's your decision to take whether you're a small company or whether you're operating wholly overseas. Again, the same outcomes apply. Yes or no there, take you down. If it's a no, i.e. you're a big company or a medium-sized company, you must make the determination for IR35 status, and you must communicate the status determination statement. Again, important point, if you don't do that, you may become liable for the tax, even if there's an agency in the chain. Sorry, Katie, you look like you're going to.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on that point because there's quite a few people asking in the chat. Going back to the slide where you talked about the criteria for a practice counting as a small, medium, or a large company, and I know you talked about there were the 3 criteria. There are a few people just asking for you to clarify that. So if they, for example, what if the company has more than 50 employees, but the other 2 criteria for the small company apply? Would you be able to just go over that, because that ties in with the flow chart quite nicely while we're at this point?
Of course. So to be a medium or large company, you have to hit 2 of those 3 boxes. So to not get the exemption for small companies, you have to hit 2 of these: annual turnover of 10.2 million or more, balance sheet of more than 5.1 million, and more than 50 employees. And if you hit 2 of those, you are regarded as a medium or large size company, and therefore the off payroll rules apply to you. So
if they've got over 50 but they didn't hit the other 2, it's still
okay. Yeah. And there's also a point that's not really clarified in the legislation too much in the timing of that. There's quite a lot of research that needs to happen in the timing. It's on the financial statement being made for the company. So without going too technical, there's a period of time where you'll have 9 months from the end of your company tax year to file your company tax returns. So actually, at the point you hit that, you may still have a 9-month window to get your compliance processes in place. So you do have time, but it's important you're just constantly monitoring your business just to see if you're tipping over into those thresholds. We're expecting to see quite a lot of rapid growth businesses that do this initial assessment on IR35, determine that they don't have to comply with off payroll rules, then grow, and don't think about it, and then hit that turnover and potentially push themselves into a liability uncomfortable place. So just something to keep a constant monitor over, I think is the only thing to say there. So coming back here, again, coming down to have you provided that SDS? Yes. Okay, I've made a determination that the role is inside IR35 and it is not being provided by an agency. So I click outcome 5. And you as the practice must make sure payments are PAYE compliant. Therefore, you must make the deductions for income tax and employees' national insurance before you pay the personal service company. So you've got that 100 as their day rate. You must deduct the 20% and pay it across to HMRC and report that as you would do with any other employees. So that's an important one to note. Go up here. Determination, let's say for now, the determination is outside IR35, and again, is the practice engaging directly with the locum, so no agency. Outcome 6, you can pay the personal service company gross without any deductions on the basis that the determination has been made to be outside IR35. The liability for an incorrect assessment remains on you though. So if you get it wrong and you make the determination that that the contract is outside IR35 and it's actually inside IR35 upon reflection, then that liability sits with the practice. It does not sit with the locum. And that's the important change that off payroll has brought in. Now, with that in mind, and as a kind of segue into the next point, we then need to talk about the important considerations. So how do you then assess IR35? It's all well and good saying IR35 applies, but how do I make the determination whether it's inside or outside IR35? And this is the important point. There's a lot to go through here, so stick with me. Feel free to ask questions all the way along. There is a tool called the Check of Employment Status Test that was issued by HMRC. In true HMRC style, they've said you can't rely on it. So that's incredibly helpful. But what it means is that it provides an indicative outcome, but you cannot rely on it to make your determinations. You've got to make your own determinations based on what is generally referred to as the sniff test, i.e., what does the contract in the round look like? And there's been a few questions before the seminar saying, if I'm in a contract for 6 months, am I automatically inside IR35? The answer is no. It is not as cut and dry as that. It is very, very perceptive. It is very, very industry specific. It is very, very role specific. So throughout these, we've looked at we're going to look at the 4 pillars. I'm going to apply them to circumstances within the veterinary industry as I see them to try and help you understand what they mean in practicality. So go on,
Sorry, just checking whether you needed to reshare your PowerPoint or not, because we're still on the PDFs.
Okay, sorry. Then
no problem.
Absolutely.
Just thought I'd jump in. Just I wasn't sure, but
very good. Okay, got that?
Yep, got it.
Okay, so the 4 pillars of IR35: mutuality of obligation, commonly known as MU, substitution, supervision, direction and control, and financial risk. There are others that supplement those, part and parcel, intention of the parties, but these are the 4 that we're going to go through today that are the important ones, and take a look at those. So coming back to the purpose for IR35 before we go into these. IR35, how you determine whether an engagement is inside or outside is the engagement business to business, i.e. the personal service company providing a service to the practice? If so, that looks like outside IR35. Or is it the individual within the PSC, the individual actually providing the service, and actually the PSC is just there for tax saving? So what we're looking at, is it a business to business engagement, or is it a business to individual engagement? If you can try and keep that in mind, I think it will help explain some of these provisions. So mutuality of obligation. Is there an expectation on you to do certain work? Is there an expectation that the practice has on the locum to do certain work, and likewise vice versa as well? What does that look like? Well, if there's an obligation to renew a contract, or if it's expected that you just roll contract to contract and there's always going to be work at the end of it, that always looks more like an employment situation. If you know that you're in a 6-month contract, you know that it's going to be continued after 6 months. And we have instances where contractors have been in their role for 6 years doing substantially the same thing. That starts to look very much like there's an employment situation going on, but that it works for the contractor and the practice for there to be an outside IR35 determination. So what we're looking at there is there an obligation to provide work, And is there an obligation to fulfill that work? Because if it was a business-to-business relationship, you would not be under obligation to perform the work. The business can decide whether to do the work or not. If you're an employee, you are obliged to provide that work, otherwise you're going to get fired. So there's an obligation there, and that obligation is a key thing to consider. It's mutuality. Is there service to be provided to the individual or to the business? And is that business or individual expected to get that work? Is there an expectation, or even worse, an obligation? Substitution is one that is talked around an awful lot, and has particular relevance to the veterinary industry, I think, because there's a lot of specialists in the veterinary industry, and therefore identifying a substitute is a difficult thing to do in some instances. So the principle of substitution is the limited company's right to provide a substitute in the event the person who was predominantly providing the service can't do it. So if you imagine a business, I'm providing a business-to-business relationship, I'm doing the accounts for someone, or I'm doing the accounts for a company. If I was ill, you would expect the business and the work to carry on. You wouldn't expect things to stop, because there will be plenty of other people in the business to provide that continued service, and a level of continuation will happen. If you are engaged as an employee and that work is created and that employee goes ill, that work's not going to get done. That work that employee is tasked with doing is not going to get done. So there you're looking at can the PSC, the limited company, provide a reasonable substitute for that contract to continue? Is the contract going to continue if the individual is unable to carry out the contract, or is it just going to stop? If it looks like it's just going to stop, then that looks a bit like employment. If it looks like it could carry on, i.e. the PSC or the locum has a bank of other PSCs or other locums that they work with, that they know they could bring in to their PSC to carry on the contract should they go ill, then that starts to look more like a business-to-business relationship. And so that would be an outside IR35 determination. So things there for locums to be thinking about are, do I have an effective bank of friends, colleagues, acquaintances who would fill in to my role to provide that service in the event I was unable to? Yes or no? If I provide this service and I'm unable to do it, does it just stop? For the practices there, you need to be thinking about, am I engaging this PSC because of the specialities that that company provides? Or am I engaging that person behind the PSC because of the speciality that that person provides? That's an important question, because if you're engaging that person, then it starts to look more like you're engaging them for services of the individual, which is inside IR35. If you're engaging the PSC because of the speciality that PSC provides, it's more like a business-to-business relationship and therefore outside IR35. So that's substitution is an important one, particularly in veterinary practices, I think, because often practices will want a specialist to come in, and that specialist is not easily replaceable. And so you need to be starting to think, how does that look in line with the whole contract? Remember, not one of these on their own is sufficient to turn it inside or outside IR35. So if you can't reasonably get substitution because the contract or the requirement is so specific, that's okay. That's fine. That doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically inside IR35, because the nature of the contract and the nature of the engagement requires a specialist. However, if then at the same time that specialist is being supervised by a line manager. They're expected the contract to roll on every 6 months, and they're always expected to be given their work and not get their own. Then it starts to look like more of an employment situation, and you're moving more to inside IR35. So not one of these on their own is necessarily enough to push you inside or outside, but you're looking at everything in the round to determine, what does it really look like? What do I think on this contract? Does it feel like a business to business relationship, or does it feel like a business to individual relationship?
So I've just had a quick question that just lines up with that around substitution. They've said, is it the right to send a substitute rather than an obligation to send one? Could we confirm which of those two it is?
So it's the right to substitute. An obligation to substitute, it's an interesting point. I think an obligation to substitute is not necessarily what is commonplace, because actually invariably it's the other way around. Invariably practices want, for example, a specialist to come in, and they only want that specialist to be there, because the key reason is because they don't just want any old person turning up to provide the contract. They want the specialist that they've engaged with. So there's a period between obligation and right to substitution, whereby in contract terms there will be a specification of the type of substitute you can make. So for example, there will be a right to substitution, not an obligation, but underneath that there will be an obligation for a certain set of parameters of the type of substitute that can be made. So you kind of have this read across between the two, between right and obligation, in that yes, it's a right, and the right is the key. For locums, having the right to substitute is a key contract clause in order to support an outside IR35 determination. But then you will often see locums provide an obligation that sits under that says, yes, you can substitute, but it needs to have that substitute has to be appropriately qualified. And again, that's a reasonable contract term to have. That's a reasonable expectation for a practice to have, that a business, for me, for example, come back to this situation, I'm providing accounts to a business. They don't want the receptionist to turn up to do the accounts on a day. They want another accountant. And I think that's the read across that you need to have, as the differentiation between right and obligation. But it's very much just a right. The locums are looking for a right to substitute, which is going to help an outside IR35 determination. Hopefully I've answered your question, but feel free to follow up in the chat if not. Okay, supervision, direction and control. Supervision, direction and control is again a really important one. And things like line managers, things like autonomy. You would not expect a business to lose absolute autonomy when they go in to do a function. They're expected to know what they're doing. They're being brought in to do a job. Therefore, are you bringing the PSC in to do a job with minimal supervision, direction and control? Those three things they don't have any hidden meanings. They are literally what they mean. Is that person coming in to do the job being supervised, directed and controlled by a line manager? Do they have reporting requirements? I think most importantly here, again, looking at the sniff test, there are always going to be requirements wherever you go. You go into a practice, you're going to be expected to adhere to their practice rules. You're going to be expected to follow procedures in the way that they depict. However, if you're an outside IR35 specialist, you are going to know how best to provide the service to get the job done, to get the contract done, to get the terms of that contract done. So therefore, you're going to be expected not to be controlled in that, but to have a certain level of autonomy to perform the services set out in the contract. That's not necessarily just I can't be controlled or directed in any way at all. What it means is, are the terms of what you're delivering in the contract able to be delivered autonomously, i.e. you need to come in and provide 15 surgeries over this period of time. Do you have autonomy to deliver those surgeries in the way that you think appropriate? Do you have an opportunity to direct other people as to how that should happen? Are you the specialist coming in to perform those services? And I think that's a practical application to the veterinary industry. I think a lot of people get hung up on supervision, direction and control, in that people come in and they have to conform to practice rules because it's so strict in the professional industry. Understood. That's not what that question is. It's more focused on the role and the services you're providing within your contract. Are those able to be provided autonomously? And the final very quick point is financial risk. Is the PSC taking on any financial risk for errors made? That will come in indemnities and clauses that we'll come on to in a bit, but it looks at, is the PSC taking on any risk for getting things wrong, or is the practice absorbing all of the risk? If the practice is absorbing all of the risk, then it starts to look more like an employee working in there. And I got it wrong, but you employ me, so you take on the liability. If there's a business in there and something goes wrong and that business has the insurance to take on the liability for that error of their employee, then that looks much more like an outside IR35 determination. So hopefully we covered that, how IR35 kind of works, but remember it's very much an in the round view of the situation. Not one of those determines it, but you're really looking at, am I controlled? Do I have a right substitution? Am I taking on any financial risk as a business owner? Do I have a mutuality of obligation, i.e. can I say, no, I'm not taking that contract, or I'm taking a pause? Is there an expectation for you to continue to do the work? Are you doing the work that you're always told to do? All of these things, look at it in the round and then determine whether you're providing a business to business service or more of a business to individual service. Quick touch on blanket assessments. I mentioned earlier that where you are making a status determination statement, you are under duty to apply due care and due diligence. Blanket assessments do not consider that to be the case. You must look at these 4 pillars and make a determination based on the facts of the situation. You cannot just say everyone is inside IR35. It can't be done. And it's an important point, because this next point is where you come undone on that. If you say to all locums, you're all inside IR35, and the locum comes back and says, I disagree, why? You are under obligation to provide or facilitate a disagreement process which tells them exactly why they're inside or outside IR35. And if you've made a blanket determination, you just said everyone's inside IR35, you're going to come a cropper on this point. And you have to respond with detailed explanation of why that status determination, i.e. inside or outside IR35, has been made. So as it says there, the locum has a right to challenge a status determination statement, and the practice must respond within 45 days. And that can be on an ongoing basis. The contractor locum can raise a disagreement at any point within the period of their contract. The most important point on this slide is that disagreements can be verbal. So you need to be listening out for any locums saying, oh, I don't agree with that IR35, because if they disagree verbally and it's taken as a formal disagreement, you need to respond within 45 days saying why it's inside IR35. And if you don't, you haven't completed due diligence, you haven't taken the necessary steps, and the liability moves up the chain. So as we said, if there's a recruitment agency in there, they're usually the entity that takes on the liability. If the disagreement process is facilitated, and you as the practice don't respond to justify your status determination statement, you are now liable, not the agency. So there's a big risk here. So practices really need to be listening out for any disagreements. And that again comes back to the point of having a transparent and joined up supply chain. It's so key to all of this. The disagreements can be so often viewed as a them and us situation where I don't agree with what you're saying, you're trying to stop how I'm working. Well, a simple situation of saying, well, no, we've gone through the contract, we've looked at the statement, and we think that these 3 key points apply to your contract, and therefore we're having to put this contract on an inside IR35 basis to protect you from risk and protect us from risk. That conversation is very easily had when you know the reason you're making the determination, and you can go back with some confidence to the locum as a practice owner to have that discussion. Similarly, if a practice makes a determination and you as a locum disagree with it, having a fairly frank but informed discussion of saying, well, I think I'm outside IR35 because I provide this in this way, I take on the financial risk, I'm coming in to do the specialist role that you've asked me to do, I'm doing it for a defined period of time, i.e. 6 weeks, and you're paying me to deliver that piece of work. That's a sensible conversation to have with a practice, who hopefully then should make that assumption, understand it, and open up the supply chain and be on an outside IR35 basis. That being said, if they don't do that, there are other ways that you can do that. You can claim on your tax return that you're outside IR35, and HMRC will look into it. There's a lot of detail to go into there that we don't have time for tonight. But if you go through the disagreement process and your practice disagrees with your view, you can take further steps over your own affairs. And we have certainly helped a few vets do that once a disagreement has not been adhered to. But similarly, we've used the disagreement process with a few practices, and that conversation has turned around and been much more effective. And actually the contract runs smoother. Everyone knows where they are up front. Everyone knows the role they play in the supply chain, and everyone knows what they're doing. I think that for me is super important to getting an effective relationship going between all entities in the supply chain. So the disagreements process for me can very easily be seen as an appeals process, or I'm challenging you. It shouldn't be viewed as that. It should be seen as a very clinical, I don't think this is right for these reasons. Can we have a discussion about maybe adjusting the terms of this contract? And if there's on the borderline and you as a locum say, well, actually, I think I'm outside because I'm borderline on this and I don't really know, can we change the parameters of our contract so that we're more aligned to being outside IR35? Again, everyone knows where they are, and those changes can be made. Changes to contracts can be made to make things more on an outside IR35 basis. You can't just change contract terms and then carry on with it in the normal way that you did before. If you're changing contract terms, you have to adhere to them and make sure all the working practices adhere to them to make sure it's outside IR35. But there are terms and working practices you can change as an agreement between the supplier and the locum to keep you outside IR35. So think of that as a kind of opportunity to speak to people and build professional connections. Statement of work is a separate and different mode of working. A statement of work defines a set of deliverables. So a statement of work says, it will say, I am bringing person X in to deliver surgery services for a period of time as a maternity cover. They will deliver X, their deliverables are X, they're working for a 9-month period, and there's a fixed price for that contract delivery. Statement of work is becoming much, much more popular because statement of work, if done correctly, takes you outside of the off-payroll rules. Doesn't matter how big you are as a company. So if you're a medium or big sized company, and we're doing this with a lot of companies now who don't want to take on the risk of off-payroll, but do provide outside IR35 type roles, we are putting them into statement of work contracts, and those statement of work contracts run in the same way as outside IR35, but they're taken completely outside of off-payroll rules. So the old rules apply, the PSC is liable and makes the determination. Statement of work is something that we've been increasingly implementing in the veterinary industry. It's an important point for practice owners to be considering, because there are very often situations where a defined period of time or a defined piece of work or a defined engagement or a defined contract can be created with a key set of deliverables sat underneath it. Shoehorning a contract into a statement of work will not work. So don't think of this as the magic pill to get away from IR35 off payroll changes, but it is something that practitioners should be seriously considering using as a way to mitigate against off payroll reforms if they provide outside style engagement, outside IR35 style engagements. It's a very simple process. It's not particularly complex. It's just defining key parameters of a contract and defining the key deliverables within those contracts. If you need any help on statement of work, we like to think of ourselves as specialists in that. So just have a chat. We can just have 30 minutes in more detail. I'm conscious of time, so I don't want to dwell too much on statement of work. But I'm very happy to talk through anyone who wants to actually talk through it in more detail if it's something they might be interested in for their practice. So finally, indemnities and contractual clauses. I will stop talking in a minute, I promise. This is one, though, that everyone needs to be super conscious of. The big thing we've seen is that practices, end clients, this is typically in banking, hasn't necessarily found its way into veterinary practices just yet. The end clients are putting in huge waterfall clauses into contracts, which says any tax that is delivered on us as a result of this engagement now falls down the chain to the contractor. Those can be huge liabilities there, and they're looking to put the onus back onto the contractor to try and deflect or mitigate from legislative changes. It's a big problem because some of these clauses are unlimited liability clauses. So you can be liable for huge sums of money as an individual quite easily if you ignore these indemnity clauses and contractual terms. So all parties in the supply chain should be looking out for these. That's practices working with recruitment agencies. There are indemnity clauses being put in there quite commonly. Locums watching out for waterfall clauses, seeing the tax liability flow down the chain. I put here they are largely untested though, it's all brand new. So often they're very open-ended, i.e. unlimited liability. Typically clauses like that might be void for uncertainty, so worth testing. Employers, national insurance cannot be shifted onto the employee. So there where an end client is liable for employers, national insurance, but they're trying to transfer all liability down the chain. That could be contrary to what's allowed. And just normal tax rules where there's an employment situation, the employer is liable first, not the employee. So important thing to consider, check your contracts, preferably have your contracts checked. I do know that in the veterinary industry, the contracts sometimes come after the engagement starts. I do get that. Please try not to do that where you can. But practices, get your contracts reviewed, make sure they're up to date. Locums, watch out for onerous clauses that could invite a lot of liability onto yourself. There's a final one there, umbrella companies. We spoke earlier about umbrella companies. They are seen as a good solution for lots of people. There is an increased position happening in the veterinary industry for loan schemes. Loan schemes are not umbrella companies. They pay in loans, not in salary. those loans are not deducted for tax, and HMRC are dead against it. They will apply penalties up to 100% of the tax. There's a huge risk there. Please do not use a loan scheme, an advance scheme, anything that sounds like a payment which is not being subject to tax. You need to have it reviewed, and we review all of any scheme that you're invited to use. We review for free to check it, just to make sure people don't fall into these traps, because we've got so many clients who have been so badly advised in the past, and have a lot of liability on their shoulders. So that's a health warning. There is a rise in umbrellas offering loan-based schemes. I would really strongly urge you not to use them. And on that, I will stop talking. Thank you for watching. Thank you for enjoying that. I think I only got one jargon comment, which I'm pretty pleased with. 5.
No, then you got £5. That's great.
Okay.
£5.
Crikey. £5. I'm happy with that. Okay. Thank you all. Is there any questions there that I haven't covered, or anything anyone would like me to go into in greater detail?
We've got a few ones coming through here. Could we go through a little the self-employed status? Rhys mentioned in the beginning he would go over a little bit on that.
So self-employed status as in the options for working as a self-employed person, maybe that?
So Laura, feel free if you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to. Or she said yes, that's exactly what she means.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. So you can work through a PSC, personal service company, limited company. And the reason people do that is because it stops liability from passing to you as an individual. So if you are in a limited company, you should always imagine that limited company as a shield, which can go bankrupt, and the liability, i.e. limited liability of the partnership as well, and limited company, they stop liability being passed on to the individual. So that's a really important one, especially when you're running a company and you start maybe taking out loans, or you start taking out business debts, and you go through that process. That liability can't be invited onto the individual unless there are certain circumstances met, which can't kind of deliberately avoid liability through that method, but it protects you. It protects you. And in addition, limited companies are used because as a company owner, you can take your money out through dividends as part of your shareholding, and the dividend rates start at 7.5%, go up to 38.5%, 38.1%, but means that you can take that money out more efficiently from a tax perspective. So that's limited company. There's limited liability partnership. Partnerships are taxed based on profits. So you're taxed on trading profits rather than on income. But again, the purpose of a limited liability partnership is that you don't invite any liability on yourself. It stops short at the partnership level. So those are the two ones that are affected into IR35. The other ways of working are as a sole trader. A sole trader, you are taxed as income. You're at income tax rates on all of the profits of your company. So effectively, the business, you're still operating as a business, but the business and you are one and the same. That means the liabilities of the business are your liabilities. That means the taxes of the business are your taxes. And so it's much more of a income-based arrangement, I guess would be the best way to say that. And there's finally umbrella companies. Umbrella companies exist to employ you. So end clients, let's say a practice may not want to pay employer national insurance. They may not want to have to pay for holiday pay. They may not want to have to take on maternity pay or sickness pay. They may still want a contractor. And what they do in that instance is they say, I'll pay £100 day rate for a contractor, but it's on an inside IR35 basis. So what tends to happen in those instances is the the practice will pay the £100 to the umbrella, and the umbrella will then employ you. So the umbrella deducts the employer's national insurance, the employee's national insurance, holiday pay, general PAYE tax, and then pays you the net. So it's like being a contractor, but also being employed. And that's a very, very common method for people who are self-employed, especially now more and more people are inside IR35 to operate. Umbrellas are increasing in popularity. Again, just be super careful which umbrella you use. And I think that's a really important point. If it looks, I know HMRC say it, so I hate repeating it, but if it does look like there's a load of money that's not being taxed somewhere, it is avoiding tax. And whilst avoiding tax isn't necessarily illegal, it's certainly frowned upon in the circumstances where you don't ever intend to pay that tax. So just be careful with umbrellas. But umbrellas are, if you think about it in the straight sense of what we were discussing with IR35, IR35 has been brought in so that more people are taxed PAYE and the tax system is simplified. More people are taxed as employees. Well, umbrellas provide that very service for HMRC. They tax people as employees, they deduct money and they pay it across to HMRC. So umbrellas really do fit in with the idea of what IR35 is trying to achieve.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
We've got quite a few questions coming in as well, but I'm also
happy to do I'm happy to do an FAQ afterwards and type up some answers.
Yeah, so we've got some really great questions coming through. So we'll maybe take one or two more, but don't worry, anyone that has put their questions in, we will answer them and we will send it out in the recording. So don't you worry, I'm just very aware of people's time and everyone's time is precious. So just before we hand back over to Rhys for one or two questions, we just want to let everyone know that we're all very excited because we are getting to meet in real life at London Vet Show. And we have got a community mastermind happening. And I hear you ask, what the hell is that? Well, look, it's a place where we can actually get together, roundtable discussion, and actually come together to solve some problems, get your insights so that we can actually build the resources and educational platforms that you're looking for. You keep saying to us, we love the fact that you can introduce us to financial professionals, but we want more education. We want to actually educate ourselves. We want to have a one-stop shop where we can get everything we need from VetYou, from our trusted partners, from our trusted professionals. So we want to use our kind of power hour of community mastermind on the 11th of November to do just that with our community, to co-create the stuff that you want. And we have 5 Vet Show tickets to give away. So that's your full CPD for 2 days, free on us and Vet Show, but you just need to be able to make the 11th of November at 3 p.m. till 4 to join us. So if you haven't got a Vet Show ticket, or you're thinking, oh, I'd love to come, but I can't afford it or whatever, then look, message us, because we'd love, especially you lot, which majority of you guys are locums and stuff like that, we would absolutely love for you to join us. So we're going to offer it on a kind of first come, first serve basis. So please do email hello@vetyou.co.uk or whack your name down here in the chat and say, yeah, I'm in, I'd love to come. And we will get those tickets to you, because it's a great opportunity to come together, get your CPD points, but also join us to co-create the things that you want to. So that would be absolutely brilliant. So I'm going to pass back to Katie and Matt. We'll take 1 or 2 more questions, and then the rest, don't worry, we will answer. Rhys will answer in the recording. So yeah, huge thank you, Rhys. So much information there. I'm sure many will be watching the recording to go over the finer detail that you've shared. So Katie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ebony. And there are details of the other events that we've got coming up as well, shared on the screen at the moment too. I'm just having a little look to see which of these questions to answer. We've had quite a few that have come in here, Rhys, about contracts. Should we, the PSC, be providing our own contracts to the practice or employer for any new contracts if they refuse to be signed or returned by the practice or employer? Should we reconsider taking any locum appointment with them? And just to follow up to that, there were a couple of people that added on there as well. If you change the terms of the contract, do you have to pay employment level tax up until the date of the change of that contract too. So a couple of contract questions there.
So the contract, so there was a question there which I think has been answered correctly, which is it a legal requirement to provide the SDS before the contract? Yes, well, it's not a legal requirement, but the SDS should be provided before the contract. Otherwise, the person who has not provided the SDS retains the liability. That's an important point to follow on for what you're saying there is employment status paid up until that point. If you can get all of the employment status points clarified before the contract, then you're in a much better position. However, for example, we had a case 2 weeks ago where there was a outside IR35 determination made, and then 3 months into the contract, they realized they got it wrong, and they made the inside IR35 determination, and the agency or the recruiter was liable for all of that back tax for that 3 month period. They had to make a settlement with HMRC and they had to pay it across to HMRC. So the answer is yes. If you make an incorrect determination or you don't make a status determination, you are liable for that chunk of money that you've paid across, even if you've paid across gross amounts. Even if you paid £100 across, you're going to have to pay those 20s from the earlier example for the period of time that the status determination was outside. So that's an important point to make, is make sure you try and get it right before the contract starts. The status determination is due to be issued before the first payment is issued. Second question with the contracts. In an ideal world, I would say yes, the PSC should be inviting the practice to sign their terms of contract, because clearly the locums contract terms are going to be more beneficial than I imagine the practices would. That is very much an ideal world, and very rarely happens. I find that invariably practices and then clients insist on their own terms of conditions being provided and do not deviate from those, do not vary those very easily. That being said, obviously the smaller practices may not even have contractual terms. And so again, in spirit of creating that supply chain transparency and openness, absolutely, if you can offer a small practice some really good terms and conditions by which the contract is going to run, and by which we're going to be able to suss out how everything's going to run, everyone's in their place, everyone knows where everything is, that's a great start to a business relationship from my view. So yes, absolutely, if you've got your own terms and conditions, those can be very easily found and template form all over the place. Just start to bespoke them, to be thinking about these pillars of IR35, think about how you're going to be providing your services, what risk you want to take on, what you're prepared to take on, and then by all means provide them to the practice if they either don't have them or they're prepared to do it. But I would also say to your second question, where the practice is not providing contractual terms, or where there are they refuse to sign any contractual terms, you are entering into a business relationship without any kind of cover. That means you can just, anything can happen at any time. If you make an error, there's going to be a massive dispute over who takes on the liability there. If something happens to the process of the contract, you've got nothing to fall back on. So I would always say that any engagement has to be subject to contractual terms, even if they're very loose, even if they're clearly they wouldn't be loose in an ideal world. But I do understand the need for speed in the veterinary industry is important. But I think a contract is always a good thing to have, but sometimes sadly missing in the veterinary world.
Super, thank you so much, Rhys. I realise we've got a couple of other questions that are in amongst the chat as well, but I'm very conscious of your time and everyone else's time as well. So thank you so much for going so in depth on such a complex topic and making that more understandable, Rhys. It's much appreciated for your time and expertise.
No problem at all. As I said, anyone who wants to talk to me, free consultation is a given for VetYou members. So just feel free to drop me an email and we'll have a chat through some of the finer points and try to apply them to your own specific circumstances.
Thank you, Rhys, and thank you again for the fantastic flow charts as well. We popped the link in the chat so you can access those.
Great.
They came on the registration link, and we'll put those in the recording as well for anybody that wants to catch hold of those too. They're really, really helpful. So thank you so much for your time on those, Rhys, as well.
No
and
problem.
for the extra time of answering the questions too. We'll make sure that any questions that didn't get answered in the chat get across to Rhys. And like you said, if we do a little FAQs diagram, I know that will be really helpful to everyone as well. We've got lots of lovely thanks coming in the chat for you as well, Rhys. Lots of thank you so much. Very helpful, very clear. Lots of thanks. So if any of you are coming to London Vet Show next week, please do join us at the mastermind session. Like Ebony said, we'd love to have you there. We'd love to have your input. You can see the link on the screen at the moment to register for that specific session. We do have a couple of tickets left. If anybody does want to take us up on those and come along to the session, we'd love to gift those to you as well. So either drop a message in the chat to me or email us at hello@vetyou.co.uk. And finally, just to wrap up, we'd love to see a few of you at our Talk Money Week event next week. It is Talk Money Week, which is a money and pension service event that goes on for 5 days, but we've made our own event for that, where we've got financial advisor coming to talk about financial well-being. We'll also be talking about money mindset. We'll be letting you meet a few of the people that we work with at VetYou, and obviously having our mastermind session too. So we would love to see you there. So you can see the registration link up on the screen. And just again, a huge thanks to Rhys. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and making that very complex topic a lot more understandable, Rhys. We all really appreciate it.
No problem. Delighted to be here. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me.
Thank you
Rhys,
so
thank
much.
you. Thank you again for your time. Katie, thank you for hosting us so wonderfully again. And we look forward to seeing many of these people at the London Vet Show next week.
Amazing. I hope you all have a lovely evening. Good to see you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks again, Rhys.